.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest is Chris Hayes, host of Up with Chris Hayes on MSNBC and editor-at-large at The Nation. His new book is called Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy. People have been tweeting in questions, have been emailing in questions, have been Facebooking us. This is Bob Vella of Longview, Washington, who emailed this question. He asks, trust in America's institutions is falling at an alarming rate, and for good reason. Just about everywhere we look, there's abuse of power and corruption. The public's reaction has generally been apathetic and insensitive primarily. Most people feel powerless to effect any positive change. Is the news media complicit in this lack of national moral outrage due to its corporate practice of not upsetting the establishment? Chris Hayes.
I think it is partly complicit, but I also think there's a lot of distrust in the media itself. And when you have distrust in the mechanisms by which you even get information, it's hard to stoke outrage because people discount information that they hear. So, you know, there are a lot of folks who just don't believe what, you know, might be reported on Democracy Now!, might even be reported in the New York Times, which is an establishment publication, because they've been told by the people they do trust, Glenn Beck or Rush Limbaugh, that those are completely untrustworthy sources. Part of the issue we have right now is that and I'm going to sound a little bit like a nostalgic or a conservative here, but there is no common table that the American people come to. There just isn't, for better or for worse. And I think there's great things about that, about the death of the kind of broadcast era, and there's troublesome things about that. But the fact is, the conversation that we have about public life, even the facts that we have at our disposal, the things that we learn day to day, there is no common table that we receive them from. We all get them from different places, increasingly balkanized. And that means even when there is outrage, that outrage is specific in its targets and diffuse in different ways, and in sometimes intention across these ideological lines.
Let me ask you about David Brooks's comment last week, the New York Times columnist who wrote a piece called Why Our Elites Stink, in which he took issue with your book. He wrote, quote, I'd say today's meritocratic elites achieve and preserve these status not mainly by being corrupt, but mainly by being ambitious and disciplined. They raise their kids in organized families. They spend enormous amounts of money and time on enrichment. They work much longer hours than people down the income scale, driving their kids to piano lessons and taking part in conference calls from the waiting room. He goes on to write, today's elite lacks the self-conscious leadership ethos and the racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic old boys network of the past did possess. Your response, Chris Hayes?
Well, there's a whole variety of things to that. I mean, in terms of his assertion that they don't get there because they get there because of being hardworking and disciplined, as opposed to being corrupt. I mean, you can be both. In fact, there's a lot of hardworking, disciplined, totally corrupt folks on Wall Street, for instance. I don't think we have to choose between the two. And it, you know, I make a book-length argument to support my contention, so I can't, you know, refute it here. I think people really zeroed in this idea that the folks at the top work harder. I think that caused a lot of frustration and anger in people that read that column. You know, I just don't think that's borne out by the facts. There's been some interesting data recently about people at the top of the income spectrum are working longer and longer, and in some senses working longer than folks right beneath them. And that's a trend that has happened recently. And it says something about the value that folks have for leisure time. But the choice that's being made to work harder or longer for folks that have...
And longer might not be harder.
Longer might not be harder. And also, let's remember, you know, it's a very different decision if you are working a job that you find immersively fulfilling, that you love, that stokes all of your soul, that gives full expression to your being, than if you are a caretaker, a home health care worker, a janitor, a million different other jobs that people may like or may not like, but don't have that kind of, you know, identity relationship to the way that they are. So, and we all know that people at the bottom of the scale and the working poor work incredibly hard, incredibly hard. So it just seems like a self-justifying story to tell.
And getting from one job to another to another.
Exactly. And, you know, that self-justifying story that he tells is precisely part of the problem, because that's the self-justifying story. That's the heart of the problem of the way we think of meritocracy, which is the people at the top have gotten there because they deserve it.
Let's talk about climate change and how this fits into this picture. The 2012 drought disaster is now the largest in half a century, among the 10 largest of the past century, according to a report released Monday by the National Climatic Data Center. That's just one bit of information. The forest fires in Colorado, the drenching rain in
record
Florida,
highs,
the incredible heat wave this country is experiencing. How does that fit in with the elites? So
it fits in this way. I mean, my big concern, I think climate change is the biggest problem. It's the biggest challenge we face, and it's also a place where our inaction is the most dramatic in some senses. People barely even give it lip service in the conversation in Washington, D.C. anymore. I mean, it's just essentially evaporated from the conversation. The problem with climate change that's distinct in some ways is that it requires a certain level of mediation to take seriously. If you live in Youngstown, Ohio, which has a massively high unemployment rate, you don't need anyone to tell you that unemployment is a problem in Youngstown, Ohio, because you see the empty stores, you see the people out of work, you know them, you are them, they're in your family. If you're in a neighborhood that has incredibly high crime rates, you don't need anyone to tell you that high crime is a problem. You yourself have been victim, people you know have been victim. Climate works in a different way. We are not, as human beings, equipped to just perceive what is essentially an imperceptible gradual rise in global average temperature.
But people are experiencing extreme weather, and
yes,
if the networks would simply, as they flash the words extreme weather, right, severe weather, also flash
sure,
the words climate change, we would know pretty darn fast, like the rest of the world.
That's right, but that's a mediation question, right? We need people to be putting the dots together, right? To say this is part of it. Now, I think that when you have this distrust, you have distrust of science, for instance, you have distrust of elites in general, it's a harder case to make. What I think is happening now for the first time, and Bill McKibben made this point on my show, and I thought it was kind of an interesting one, which is, look, the weather, the wolf is at the door. The weather is freaking out. We no longer have to worry about mediation or even persuading people it's real. He basically has this perspective, which I've become more and more persuaded by, which is that the climate disaster as it unfolds before us is going to do the convincing that 10 or 15 years of the press or, scientists have failed to do.
When Democracy Now! Was at the UN Climate Change Conference in Durban this past December, and I spoke to you in your show from there, I also spoke to Mark Morano, who is publisher of Climate Depot, a website run by the Climate Denier Group Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. I asked him about President Obama's record on climate change.
His nickname is George W. Obama. Obama's negotiator, Todd Stern, will be here today. They have kept the exact same principles and negotiating stance as President George Bush did for 8 years. Obama has carried on Bush's legacy. So as skeptics, we tip our hat to President Obama in helping crush and continue to defeat the United Nations process. Obama has been a great friend of global warming skeptics at these conferences. Obama has problems, for us because he's going through it through the EPA regulatory process, which is a grave threat. But in terms of this, President Obama could not have turned out better when it came to his lack of interest in a congressional climate bill and his lack of interest in the United Nations Kyoto Protocol. So a job well done for President Obama.
There you have it. Mark Morano of the Climate Denier Group Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow saying President Obama is basically their best ally, calling him George W. Obama.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was doing a little bit of trolling there because I think it's actually not quite actually accurate to say there's been total continuity between the administrations even on negotiations, but that's the place where there's been the most negotiation. There's been the most continuity is in terms of the international realm, right? There's been there's a much cleaner break in terms of what's happening domestically, but in the international realm, and part of the problem we see, and this is why this is the great civilizational challenge of our time, is that climate is the ultimate collective action problem. I mean, you need states to get together, and everybody, particularly those in the developed world, the wealthiest nations, the ones that have been responsible for already putting the most carbon in the atmosphere, that have drawn out of the bank account the most, to take the hit, to say, yes, we're going to take these steps, even if you don't. Because if everyone wants someone else to go first, then no one goes first. And that's precisely the framework, increasingly, that's happening. And the people that are best equipped to lead, the nation that's best equipped to lead on this is, of course, the United States, is of course, the source of the greatest carbon emissions. And yet, for a million reasons having to do with our politics, having to do with our financial interests, etc.
Having to do with oil companies, the richest corporations on earth pouring millions into these groups and ads in the media.
Yeah, for all of those reasons, we're not doing the one thing that we need to be doing on the international stage, which is boldly leading.
So finally, Chris, what does America after meritocracy look like?
You know, I think that we can have, if you look at American history from the progressive perspective in a positive way, over the, say, from the New Deal to now, I think there's in some ways two eras of equality that had different kinds of equality developed. There was unparalleled and unrepeated since economic equality, income equality, wealth equality from basically the New Deals in the 1970s. And that's now gone by the boards. But that same period of time had a tremendous amount of inequality along lines of race and gender and sexual orientation, which wasn't even a political issue largely at the time. Since 1972 or 1973 to the present, we've seen tremendous strides made in gender equity, although still a long way to go. Strides made in racial equity, although still a huge way to go. Huge strides made in the equality of people along lines of sexual orientation. But we've seen that wealth and income equality evaporate. So I think that we need a third era of equality that combines those two. And I think that that's not an impossible task. I think we can have a society that is dynamic, that is free, that is prosperous, but also that has much greater levels of equality, much lower levels of inequality and extremes between the rich and the poor, between the rich and everybody else, and also values equality along all these other lines of identity.
And that will be achieved how?
Politics and movements. I mean, pressure from below, and that's the case in what happened. The New Deal was created by a series of social movements that restrained the plutocrats and crisis, actually, and the way the plutocrats were discredited by the crisis, which I think we discount now as we think about it. And the same thing happened in the amazing liberatory movements that 1950s, 60s, and 70s towards equality along the lines of race, gender, and sexual orientation. That's the only way we make progress.
Chris Hayes, I want to thank you for being with us, and we're going to post the second part of this conversation at democracynow.org. Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy is his book. He's editor-at-large at The Nation magazine, and he's got a new show, not so new, but it's a great show on MSNBC, Saturday and Sunday mornings, 8